Your soulmate just received a threat call about you, and shockingly, the predator is your. Something happened last night that changed the atmosphere around your connection. It was one of those moments that arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, before suddenly becoming impossible to ignore. Somewhere in the middle of the night, when everything around them seemed still, your soulmate received a call they never expected. The number was unfamiliar. The voice on the other end was serious. The message was disturbing enough to make them stop what they were doing and listen carefully. The caller mentioned you. At first, your soulmate thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Why would anyone call them and speak about you? Why would someone bring your name into a conversation that had nothing to do with them? And why did the caller sound as though they knew something they should never have known? But then came the sentence that changed everything, a warning, not a warning that could simply be laughed away. Not a random joke. Not an ordinary misunderstanding. It was the kind of statement that makes a person sit in silence afterward, replaying every word in their mind. Your soulmate couldn't immediately understand what was happening. They looked at the phone, they looked at the time, then they thought about you, and suddenly, every strange moment from the recent past seemed to connect in a way they had never noticed before. Something about the call felt intentional. Someone wanted your soulmate to become afraid. Someone wanted them to question what they knew. Someone wanted them to believe that you were connected to a hidden situation. But the most shocking part wasn't the call itself, it was what happened after the call ended. Your soulmate didn't immediately go to sleep. They stayed awake. They kept thinking. They remembered conversations they had with you. They remembered little details you may not even realize they noticed. They remembered moments when you seemed distant, moments when you suddenly became quiet, moments when you appeared to know something without explaining how you knew it, and one question kept returning: who would do this? That question became heavier as the night continued. Because the caller didn't sound like a complete stranger, there was something strangely familiar about the way certain things were said. Your soulmate couldn't prove anything, but their intuition kept telling them that the story was bigger than the call. And then came another realization. The person behind the threat might not be someone standing outside your life. They might be someone who has been much closer than anyone expected. That is where this story takes an unexpected turn, because sometimes the person creating confusion doesn't announce themselves. They smile. They act friendly. They appear helpful. They may even pretend to care about your future, and because of that, they can remain unnoticed for a long time, but hidden intentions eventually reveal themselves. Last night, your soulmate began reviewing the people surrounding your situation. One by one, they thought about acquaintances. They thought about people who had asked questions about you. They thought about people who seemed unusually interested in your private life. They thought about people who always seemed to know more than they should, and then they remembered someone. Someone whose behavior had never completely made sense. Someone who had occasionally appeared supportive but whose actions didn't always match their words. Someone who had perhaps asked questions that seemed innocent at the time. Where are you going? Who are you talking to? What are you planning? Who are you spending time with? Ordinary questions can become suspicious when they appear again and again. Your soulmate suddenly wondered whether those questions had ever been ordinary at all. But there was something else. The caller seemed to know details that weren't supposed to be public, that frightened your soulmate more than the threat itself, because knowledge leaves traces. If someone knows something private, there is usually a reason. Someone told them. Someone showed them. Someone overheard something. Or someone has been paying much closer attention than anyone realized. Your soulmate began asking themselves whether someone had been watching the situation from a distance, not necessarily in a literal sense. Sometimes people watch through conversations, social media, mutual acquaintances, rumors, or casual questions. They collect fragments, they build assumptions, and eventually, they convince themselves that they understand a story they were never actually part of. But this particular caller seemed determined to create fear. That was the part your soulmate couldn't accept. Why would anyone deliberately frighten them? Why mention you? Why make the situation sound urgent? Why make them believe they needed to act immediately? The more your soulmate thought about it, the more suspicious the entire situation became. And then something unexpected happened. They remembered something you had said before. Maybe it was only a small sentence. Maybe you didn't even realize how important it was. But suddenly, that sentence sounded different. Your soulmate remembered the way you had once warned them to be careful about believing everything they heard. They remembered how you encouraged them to look for facts instead of rumors. They remembered how you seemed uncomfortable whenever certain people came up in conversation. At the time, those moments may have seemed insignificant. Now they didn't. Now they felt like pieces of a puzzle, and your soulmate began wondering whether you had sensed something long before they did. Maybe you had noticed a strange pattern. Maybe you had recognized behavior that others ignored. Maybe you had simply trusted your instincts. Whatever the explanation, your soulmate couldn't shake the feeling that last night's call was connected to something much deeper. Then came the most unsettling possibility. What if the caller wasn't trying to protect your soulmate at all? What if the warning was actually designed to manipulate them? That changed the entire story. Because a genuine warning gives information. Manipulation creates panic. A genuine warning encourages caution. Manipulation demands immediate reactions. A genuine warning respects your ability to think. Manipulation tries to make you afraid before you can ask questions. Your soulmate began recognizing the difference. They refused to act impulsively. They refused to spread rumors. They refused to accuse someone without evidence. Instead, they started thinking carefully. And that was when they realized something powerful. Fear becomes weaker when you stop allowing it to control your decisions. The caller may have expected panic. Instead, your soulmate became observant. They started remembering details. They began questioning contradictions. They thought about who had access to certain information. They considered who might benefit from creating confusion. And slowly, the picture began changing. The person they first suspected didn't make sense. Another person didn't fit the details either. Then another possibility appeared. Someone unexpected. Someone close enough to know things. someone who had been around long enough to appear harmless, someone whose friendly behavior had made them almost invisible. This is where the shocking question emerges. Could the person everyone assumed was simply concerned actually be the one creating the confusion? Your soulmate didn't want to believe it. They resisted the thought. They told themselves they might be overthinking. They reminded themselves that suspicion isn't proof, and they were right. Suspicion is not proof. A strange feeling is not proof. A mysterious phone call is not proof. A rumor is not proof. But when several unusual details appear together, they can become a reason to pause and look more carefully. That is exactly what your soulmate decided to do. They didn't chase the mystery. They didn't confront anyone recklessly. They simply watched, and sometimes watching reveals more than arguing ever could. The next morning, your soulmate noticed something unusual. A person they hadn't expected suddenly contacted them. The message seemed ordinary, almost too ordinary. A simple question, a casual greeting, nothing threatening. Nothing obvious, but because of the call from the night before, your soulmate noticed something they might previously have ignored. The person seemed to know about the situation, not directly, not openly, but indirectly. They asked a question that was strangely specific. Your soulmate stared at the message for a long moment. How would they know that? That was the question. They didn't answer immediately. Instead, they put the phone down. They thought. Then they picked it up again. They reread the message, and suddenly, another detail from the previous week came back to them. The same person had asked something similar before. At the time, it seemed harmless. Now it felt different. Your soulmate still refused to jump to conclusions, but their awareness had changed. They realized that sometimes the truth doesn't arrive through one dramatic revelation. Sometimes it appears through patterns. One detail, then another, until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. And perhaps that is the deeper message hidden inside everything that happened. Not every voice deserves your trust. Not every warning deserves your panic. Not every person who claims to protect you actually understands what you need. And not every person who appears suspicious is guilty. The wise response is discernment. Slow down. Look at facts. Protect your boundaries, and refuse to let fear make decisions for you. Your soulmate learned that lesson last night, but they also learned something about you. They realized how deeply they cared about making sure you were okay, not because they wanted to control your life, not because they believed they owned your future, but because the idea of something unfair happening to you disturbed them. They wanted answers. They wanted clarity. They wanted the truth. And for the first time, they understood that protecting someone doesn't mean creating more fear around them. Real care means encouraging safety, honesty, and clear thinking. So your soulmate decided not to repeat the threatening message to everyone. They didn't want rumors spreading. They didn't want unnecessary panic. They wanted reliable information, and that decision changed the direction of the entire situation. Because once fear stops controlling the story, truth has room to appear. Later, your soulmate received another message. This one was different, shorter, calmer, but it contained something that made them stop. a detail only a limited number of people could have known. Your soulmate immediately remembered the call. Their heart sank with uncertainty. Could there really be a connection? They didn't know. But they knew they couldn't ignore the possibility. Then the name of a particular person entered their mind. The person who had always seemed helpful. The person who had offered advice. The person who seemed to know everybody. The person who often appeared whenever there was confusion. Could that person be involved? Again, there was no proof. And that matters. A story like this can become dangerous if suspicion turns into accusation. So your soulmate chose patience. They decided to verify instead of assume. They began separating facts from interpretations. What was actually known, what had only been suggested, what had been directly observed, what was rumor, what was fear, what was coincidence. Those questions became their protection. And then something remarkable happened. The more carefully they examined the situation, the less powerful the threat became. The mysterious caller had tried to make everything feel enormous. But facts brought the situation back down to size. Your soulmate realized that someone may have been trying to manipulate emotions. Perhaps the caller wanted them to distrust you. Perhaps they wanted to create distance. Perhaps they wanted to make your soulmate believe that you were somehow responsible for the chaos. But your soulmate refused. They remembered what they knew about you. They remembered your character. They remembered your choices. They remembered moments when you had shown patience even when you had every reason to be frustrated. They remembered the times you encouraged honesty. They remembered the moments when you chose peace instead of unnecessary conflict. And they asked themselves one simple question: does this story actually sound like the person I know? The answer wasn't what the caller wanted. No, it didn't. That realization was powerful, because manipulation often depends on making someone forget what they already know. Fear can make familiar people look unfamiliar. Rumors can turn ordinary behavior into suspicious behavior. A carefully chosen sentence can make someone question years of understanding. But your soulmate refused to forget the evidence of their own experience. They decided to judge the situation by facts, not fear, and somewhere in that decision, something shifted. The threat lost its power, the mystery remained, but panic disappeared. That was when your soulmate became stronger. They realized that whoever had made the call might have expected an emotional reaction. Instead, they received caution. Instead of running toward the drama, your soulmate stepped back. Instead of confronting someone, they sought reliable information. Instead of spreading the story, they protected your privacy. And that may have been the moment when the person behind the confusion realized something had gone wrong. Their plan wasn't working. The fear wasn't spreading. The connection wasn't breaking. The manipulation wasn't taking control, and now they had a problem. Because once someone stops reacting emotionally, manipulation becomes much harder. The person behind the mystery might have expected your soulmate to accuse you. They might have expected your soulmate to disappear. They might have expected arguments. Instead, your soulmate became more thoughtful, more careful, more protective of the truth. And then came another unexpected development. Someone else remembered hearing something, a conversation, a strange comment, a detail that had seemed meaningless before. Suddenly, it mattered. Your soulmate listened carefully. They compared what they heard with what they already knew, and the pieces began moving again. The person who had seemed completely unrelated to the situation now appeared closer to the center, but still, no accusation, no reckless confrontation, only questions, only observation, only verification, because truth does not need exaggeration. If something is real, evidence eventually speaks, and if something is false, careful investigation eventually exposes the weakness in the story. That is why your soulmate didn't allow themselves to be pulled into chaos. They waited, they watched, they listened, and while they were doing that, they realized something about themselves. They had been more afraid of losing the connection than they had admitted. The threat call had revealed that. Before last night, they might have hidden their emotions behind silence. They might have pretended not to care too much. They might have told themselves that whatever happened would simply happen. But when your name became part of a frightening conversation, their reaction exposed something deeper. They cared. They cared enough to stay awake. They cared enough to think carefully. They cared enough not to believe a stranger. They cared enough to search for the truth. And perhaps that is the real emotional revelation inside this story. Sometimes people don't understand the importance of someone until they imagine that person being placed in a difficult situation. Suddenly, everything becomes clearer. The conversations they postponed matter. The apologies they delayed matter. The truths they were afraid to speak matter. The people they thought they could lose without consequence suddenly become precious. Last night forced your soulmate to confront that reality. They couldn't control everything. They couldn't predict every person. They couldn't know every hidden motive. But they could choose how they responded, and they chose wisely. They chose caution over panic, truth over rumor, boundaries over fear, and clarity over drama. That choice may be more important than the identity of the mysterious caller, because the deepest lesson isn't simply who was the predator. The deeper question is, who are you allowing close enough to influence your peace? That question reaches beyond one phone call. It reaches into friendships, family dynamics, social circles, online conversations. Everywhere people interact, boundaries matter. Someone doesn't need to be openly cruel to be unhealthy for your peace. Sometimes the problem is constant pressure. Sometimes it's gossip. Sometimes it's manipulation. Sometimes it's someone who repeatedly makes you doubt yourself. Sometimes it's a person who creates conflict and then pretends to rescue everyone from the conflict they created. That is why discernment matters. Your soulmate began understanding that last night. They realized that being kind doesn't mean ignoring warning signs. Being trusting doesn't mean believing everything. Being forgiving doesn't mean allowing repeated disrespect. And caring about someone doesn't mean abandoning good judgment. They wanted to make sure you were safe emotionally and practically. So they decided to handle the situation responsibly. If a genuine threat existed, the right response would be to involve trusted adults or appropriate authorities rather than trying to solve the mystery alone. If the call was simply manipulation, the right response would still be boundaries and verification. Either way, fear wasn't going to be allowed to control the outcome. and that decision brought unexpected peace. The night that began with uncertainty ended with clarity about one thing. Your soulmate no longer wanted confusion between you. They wanted honesty. They wanted communication. They wanted the kind of connection where difficult information could be discussed without games. They wanted to know that if something strange happened, you could both pause and think instead of immediately turning against each other. That realization changed their perspective. Maybe the mystery wasn't only about another person, maybe it was also about the walls people build around themselves. Maybe the threat call exposed how easily silence can create space for rumors. Maybe it showed that assumptions can become dangerous when nobody asks direct questions. Maybe it was a reminder that genuine trust isn't built by pretending problems don't exist. It's built by facing uncertainty together with patience and honesty. Your soulmate understood that, and now there is one final question hanging over everything. Who was the person behind the call? The answer in this fictional story is not something to assume about any real person, but symbolically, the predator represents something that can hide in plain sight: manipulation. The person who feeds fear, the voice that wants you confused, the influence that wants you isolated, the pressure that makes you question your own judgment. Sometimes the greatest threat isn't a particular individual. Sometimes it is the pattern of allowing fear to make your choices. And once your soulmate understood that, the entire mystery became clearer. The real victory wasn't discovering a villain. The real victory was refusing to become part of the villain's game. Your soulmate didn't spread the accusation. They didn't create revenge. They didn't make reckless decisions. They protected the truth.